2015 form, then we will not be able to provide the necessary support that we would like to do. There are also some issues related to the differences in time frame. Agenda 2063 first 10 years implementation plan will end in 2023. PIDA will end in 2027. SDGs will end in 2030. And there is the overall notion is to keep the integrity of the implementation of the SDGs, so that no SDG, no one from the 17 will run ahead of the others. So how are we going to do that within this kind of change of time frame? I think we need to discuss that in detail. Also, we need to utilize, African Union should utilize better the mechanisms that, because Agenda 2063 first 10 years have established already mechanisms for its implementation that we did not yet establish in the UN for the implementation of 2030. You have the committees at the national level for domesticization. You have the national committee, and then at the government level, and then another national committee at the private sector, civil society, diaspora, others, and all of them are reporting to the ministerial committee of the AU, and the ministerial committee is reporting to the summit. So all these kind of monitoring and evaluation structures does not yet exist in the Agenda 2030. So this is a point of strength here in the system in the African Union that can be utilized very well in influencing the action in 2030 in the United Nations. And I hope that this is going to be important. Also, we need to establish or to create a niche for the follow-up on implementation. There is no dedicated conference now in the United Nations to follow up on the implementation of commitments that have been made to Africa's development. There have been a monitoring mechanism that was established 2 years ago, and we present reports about the implementation of commitments, but these reports stop there, and it does not go further than that. At the time that LDCs, LLDCs, and the Seids have 3 or 4 monitoring and evaluation committees and conferences that are held. I mean, next month we are going to Turkey for the review of the Istanbul Plan of Action on the LDCs. I understand that it is different, but Africa should have its own evaluation and review conferences in the United Nations. This is the United Nations Conference on the review of the LDCs. Why is Africa silent on this? This is something that needs to be addressed. So these are, Madam Chairperson, some reflections on how, or maybe some questions or some provocative points on how can we really work together to make the relations within RCM or outside the RCM better between the United Nations and the African Union with regard to the implementation of the Agenda 2063 and the Agenda 2030. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Abdelaziz, for sticking to the 10 minutes and for raising practical, critical issues of collaboration between the UN system and the African Union Commission. Now I'm moving to the next panelist, Mr. Kostas Stamoulis, Assistant Director General, Economic and Social Development Department, FAO. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair, distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen. First, I would like to convey greetings from the Director General of FAO, Jose Graciano da Silva, who's currently in Abidjan for another important event, the FAO Regional Conference for Africa. Now, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development with 17 goals, 169 targets, and I think the latest count, 231 indicators approved, heralds a new development model. It's not just a reproduction of the MDGs. It is not the fundamental element in this model. There is not anymore a addressed to the South, to the developing countries, with North supporting. It's addressed to all countries, because no country can claim today that unless it changes fundamentally, is on a sustainable development path. I think that's a very important part and the nature of the SDGs. The SDGs are therefore universal in scope and concern all countries, but they're also cross-cutting. And a silo approach to the SDGs is simply not going to work. This is clear from the document. So partnerships and working cross-cutting with institutions, governments, and other stakeholders is key. I know that those elements of partnership and cross-cutting are key in the 2063 agenda. Now, malnutrition remains pervasive in Africa, and I think the Commissioner of AU was very clear in the data she presented. But beyond the human and social cost of malnutrition, we have tremendous economic costs, as malnutrition causes handicaps for life at critical ages. Agriculture is also key for Africa, for malnutrition and for extreme poverty, and the data also were presented by the EU Commissioner, so I won't repeat them. Now, food and agriculture has an enormous footprint in the 2030 agenda and are key to achieving core objectives of that agenda. The 2030 agenda recognizes the key role of food and agriculture, and if you take agriculture as broadly as considering fisheries and forestry, there are many goals and targets in which agriculture is part. A comprehensive vision of food, nutrition, and agriculture is reflected in the SDG 2, where the achievement of food and nutrition security is directly linked with sustainable agriculture, rural development, and sustainable management and use of natural resources. For FAO, Africa is well placed to attain the universal set of goals encapsulated in the Agenda 2030 and the aspirations of the 2063 Agenda. African heads of state and government have courageously agreed to eradicate hunger by the year 2025. To achieve this and achieve the SDGs by 2030 required targeted and innovative interventions, as I said, cross-cutting, including food, health, sanitation, social protection, education, gender empowerment, training, and improved infrastructure, to name a few, all with a special focus on the most vulnerable. This will create the type of virtuous cycle of development leading to food security and improved nutrition. Africa, through the African Union, has created the momentum by the 2014 Malabo Declaration, through which African leaders called for a fundamental shift in the continent's agricultural and rural development in line with the aspirations of the Africa's Agenda 2063, which emphasizes unity, self-reliance, integration, and solidarity. Also in 2014, African nations joined all other states in adopting the Rome Declaration and its related framework for action at the Second International Conference of Nutrition. I think these are extremely important commitments which gives us hope that that hunger in Africa will be defeated. FAO has a long history of collaboration with the African Union, and a lot of the initiatives mentioned by the Commissioner FAO has been part of, under the leadership of the AU. We are collaborating with the AU NEPAD in the implementation of CAADP and also the Malabo Declaration. Through this engagement, key nutrition and food security indicators have been mainstreamed into the CAADP results and monitoring and evaluation frameworks to enhance mutual accountability. For the SDG process and the Agenda 2063, this is an important period, as an important phase which dedicated to national efforts to select from the broad agenda a set of national goals and targets, develop plans and partnerships, and mobilize means of implementation in all forms. We will all be challenged to deploy our full knowledge, expertise, resources, the lead, this is doable. It's a great opportunity to harmonize the implementation of the agendas. FAO's work addresses the nexus between people's and planet's needs. Under the leadership of countries, FAO will work with other UN agencies and other partners to strengthen the capacity of countries at their request and leadership and their regional economic communities to domesticate the AU Agenda 2063 and Agenda 2030 and the first implementation plan of the Agenda 2063 in the national development plans as per our mandate. FAO is committed to working with the African Union to realize the Agenda 2063 in our areas of competence. In this respect, FAO, with its available expertise and resources, stands ready to support Africa in achieving its priorities in firm collaboration with African Union, other regional institutions, and humanitarian and development partners. Coming to measurement, accountability, and monitoring. For the implementation of the SDGs and the 2063 agenda, it was mentioned several times in this room this morning that we need a strong monitoring, follow-up, and review system. For the SDG agenda, FAO's mandate is relevant to about 24 SDG indicators in all the 3 tiers. The first tier, which is methodology and data, have been agreed upon. The second tier, methodology, has been agreed upon, but data are not widely available. And the third tier, that neither of the two is available. FAO stands ready to strengthen the capacities of countries to contribute to the global indicator frameworks, because this is a country-driven process, the GIF, the global indicator frameworks on the SDGs, but also other national specific indicators in our area of mandate. There are great challenges and great opportunities, and that has also been repeated in here. The next few years will be crucial for Africa if we are to go down in history as the zero hunger generation. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stamoulis. Now I give the floor to my colleague, Mr. Abdallah Hamdok, Deputy Executive Secretary, Knowledge Generation, ECA. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Moderator. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As we say, all protocol formalities are observed. I would like to have welcomed so many of you to this beautiful city of Addis Ababa. But let me start. I think you will all agree with me that the year that ended, 2015, was a very special year in the African and the global calendar. It all started here in Addis Ababa, in this very room where we are sitting here today, when the whole world converged here on the third conference on financing for development, where Africa has actually hosted for the first time in its history, the third one. And we all know that it came up with the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which we all contributed to. Then we moved on to New York when the the General Assembly, the Global Summit on Post-2015 Development Agenda, approved the 2030 SDGs in September in New York. And the year ended with the COP21 in Paris in December, when we approved the very, I think, an impressive agreement on climate change. In all these processes, Africa had common positions. And I think it came about because of the collective working together, Africa and its partners, and particularly the UN system. We helped shaping these common positions in all its phases and shapes. But I think the one that stands out as probably very unique to Africa, and I wouldn't shy from repeating what Mr. Lopez, my boss, and Dr. Maruping kept saying, that Africa is the only region in the world that has a common position on post-2015 development agenda. I think we owe it to ourselves. But also, this came about, let us remember this, because of the experience we had with the MDGs in its 15 years of existence. We all remember so well in the year 2000 when the MDGs were approved, there was very little consultation with Africa. Yet, it was development related, and if it is relevant to any region in the world, it was Africa. So this time round, Africa was well prepared, and I think we are very proud that we are able to come up with this. And I think, having said this, Common African Position has shaped 2063 and its 10 years plan, but also the 2030 agenda. So there is a lot of commonalities between the two. Whether you look at the economic, social, or environment, issues of poverty, issues of social protection, climate change, and all that, they are in both. But also, there are the uniqueness of African its own issues. Issues of political, we are aspiring to have a union government in the continent, cultural issues, shared values and all that, peace and security, silencing the guns, but most importantly, the integration agenda. We have the milestones set out in 1990 in Abuja, 91, Abuja Treaty that set a journey for the integration. I think Africa owe it to itself also to have and to preserve those unique elements which are expressed very well in 2063. I think also the ongoing exercise on the mapping will help this process, help us to come up with something that, as Dr. Kaluko said, there is 90% convergence in terms of the aspirations and goals. And I'm sure even the indicators are probably much more than the 69, 70, because the mapping should not be a mechanical, technical issue. There are a lot of common elements in this. But what is required, I would like to believe, we need to come up with a common implementation framework. The last thing we would want to have to subject our senior policymakers to multiple development frameworks. On one side, Agenda 2063, on the other side, Agenda 2030. This process, if it's not managed well, it can be extremely messy. There are requirements of our partners who already would only see 2030. In Africa, we would like to see our uniqueness 2063. The UN system can help in this, and I think this is a very important challenge we need to look at. There are issues of advocacy, sensitization. We need to make the details of both frameworks clearly understood by our policymakers, and particularly at the national level. And here, issues of monitoring and evaluation tools become extremely important. We need to work for managing for results and all those jargons of the UN and others, set clear targets and agree on indicators on both. And I think here, relying and having lived through the experience of the MDGs, the annual reporting of MDGs, we have that experience. So let us be innovative, come up with some sort of an agreement that I would like to believe if we can aspire for one report that meet the aspirations and the interest of both processes, it will be extremely useful. What is required in this whole process? I think there is need for institutional capacity building, particularly at national level, and in a specific sense, we need to have a very strong capacity in the development planning processes and all that at country level to be able to harmonize and manage this process. But this also relies on the important issue of the quality and quantity of data, statistics. As the motto goes, if you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. And I think this is an extremely important area. We know the politics of statistics. If you do not control your statistics, you cannot control your narratives. Your stories will always be told about you by somebody else and all that. So I think we need to look at this. And also, it's a political exercise. Our member states need to recognize this and put resources on it. Statistics is not a peripheral issue. Then I think the role of the UN-wide system on this, in supporting Agenda 2063 and 2030. And here I would like to reiterate the words of my senior brother, Majid Abdelaziz, on PIDA, the Partnership on Africa's Integration and Development Agenda, the successor of the 10-year Capacity Development Plan. I would like to think together as a UN system and the AUC, we can for sure make the UN system pronounce on this. And here, particularly our agencies that are having heavy presence like OSA and others in New York can play an important role in this. But also let us look at it. We should not aspire for the aggregation of individual program of ours and then put it together and call it this is support of the UN system to the PIDA or the Agenda 2063. Let us aspire for moving beyond that, and issues of finance become key to this. We need to work on that. Madam Moderator, let me just conclude by having a footnote. I listened very well to my brother Majid on that AU have singled out only 3 or 4 institutions to support the Agenda 2063. You know, as one person who have seen the process of this RCM moving from the consultation, it was called, you remember 15, 20 years ago, it was called the Regional Consultation Mechanism. It was a talk show and moved on to become Regional Coordination Mechanism. I think the journey is testified that it is anchored so well on the African Union agenda and all that. It is perfect, but I think working together, we can definitely create that synergy, and maybe I can see, I mean, I've never been to RCM where we have the leadership of the African Union, commissioners, the chairperson, and everybody, colleagues, directors, and all that, participating in numbers on this. So this is quite gratifying, and I think it promises that we will, working together, push this agenda for the interest of development in the continent. I will stop here, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abdallah. You have done less than 10 minutes. And just also referring to your presentation, the emphasis in terms of moving forward on a common implementation framework, and also what will be required for the Agenda 2063-2030 process in terms of collaboration between the 2 main agencies. Now moving to Mr. Nathan Mutizwa Mangiza, excuse me, I hope I'm reading the name correctly, Director and Principal Advisor, Policy and Strategic Planning, United Nations Human Settlements Program. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, AU commissioners and representatives, UN colleagues, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. My brief statement is about a specific experience within the United Nations system that we believe could contribute to the AU-UN partnership for the implementation of Agenda 2063 and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This experience relates specifically to Goal 11 of the 2030 Agenda, which, as you may recall, is on cities and human settlements. The experience also relates to what is being called the new urban agenda. This is the outcome document expected to come out of the United Nations Conference on Housing and Sustainable Urban Development, Habitat 3, to be held in October in Quito, Ecuador, later this year. But before describing this experience, I would like to highlight 4 interrelated issues on Goal 11. Firstly, the important role of well-planned and managed urbanization in sustainable development is no longer in doubt. Secondly, well-planned and managed urbanization can contribute to industrialization and structural transformation, both of which are very important for the African continent. Thirdly, cities and towns currently contribute an average of 70% of the world's gross domestic product. Fourthly, cities and towns are now the dominant habitat of humanity, we know that by 2035, more than 50% of Africa's population will be urban. Now, during the last 2 years, a working group of the High-Level Committee on Programs, the HLCP of the United Nations, has been working on a paper titled Urbanization and Sustainable Development, a UN system input to a new urban agenda. That working group consists of 24 system organizations. After almost 2 years of work, the draft paper was approved by the HLCP last June. It will be considered by the CEB, the Chief Executives Board for Coordination, at its meeting to be held in Vienna at the end of this month. Now, apart from being an input to the Habitat 3 preparatory process, the paper represents the common thinking of the UN system on the role of urbanization in sustainable development and on what could be done jointly to turn this common thinking into reality through projects and programs, as well as other activities, including monitoring. The paper also provides a link between Goal 11 of the 2030 Agenda and the expected outcome document of Habitat 3. The paper proposes a multi-stakeholder partnership on the implementation of Goal 11 and the outcome of Habitat 3. It is envisaged that the partnership will use a revamped version of the World Urban Campaign, presently anchored in UN Habitat, as a platform. It is also envisaged that the partnership will be launched in July at the third session of the Habitat 3 PrepCom, to be held in Surabaya, Indonesia. The working group has also prepared a draft CEB statement based on the draft paper to be delivered at Habitat 3. In terms of substance, very briefly, the paper presents 10 guiding principles on sustainable urbanization and 10 levers of transformative change considered to be necessary to achieve the desired outcomes of sustainable urbanization and sustainable development in general. Very briefly, the levers are developing and implementing integrated national urban policies within the framework of national development plans. Number 2, strengthening urban legislation and systems of governance. Number 3, harnessing the urban economy, creating employment opportunities, and improving existing working conditions for all. Number 4, strengthening municipal finance. Number 5, reinvigorating spatial planning and urban design. Number 6, promoting universal access to quality basic services. Number 7, promoting adequate housing for all income categories of urban residents. Number 8, strengthening gender equality and women's empowerment. Number 9, placing culture at the heart of sustainable urban development. And the last one is promoting resource efficiency and the circular economy at the city level. The proposals contained in the HLCP paper are very much similar to the ideas contained in both the Common African Position on Habitat 3, adopted by African Ministers of Housing and Urban Development in Abuja in February this year, as well as ideas contained in the Abuja Declaration for Habitat 3, adopted by a wide range of partners at the same meeting. Both documents are based on Agenda 2063 and provide an important link between Agenda 2063 and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Habitat 3 process. The multi-stakeholder partnership proposed in the paper is very inclusive and adaptable to the regional and national levels, including in Africa. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize that in forging lasting partnerships between the United Nations and the African Union for the implementation of both Agenda 2063 and the 2030 Agenda, there needs to be a shared vision and common understanding of the goals of both agendas. This is what the UN HLCP process has tried to achieve with respect to Sustainable Development Goal number 11. That process is also likely to result in a robust, issue-based, and inclusive multi-stakeholder partnership framework capable of facilitating cooperation in both normative and operational projects and programs at the global and regional levels, as well as at the national levels, where both of these agendas will need to be domesticated, as emphasized by previous speakers. The proposed partnership goes well beyond the United Nations system organizations and would benefit from the participation of the African Union and also of civil society organizations and private sector organizations. UN Habitat stands ready to continue working with other UN system organizations in Africa and with the African Union on the urban and human settlements dimensions of both Agenda 2063 and Agenda 2030. Thank you very much, Madam Moderator.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mutizwa Mangiza, and also for adhering to the 10 minutes. Now I give the floor to Professor Eddie Maloka, Chief Executive Officer, African Peer Review Mechanism. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. And in the interest of time, I think we'll say all protocol is duly observed. I want to start by making an observation. There is a presentation and discussion on strengthening the RCM Africa, the draft report on the alignment of the RCM clusters in Africa, which has just been circulated. I can see that they're in page 6. There are some recommendations and the options that have been presented in terms of the future or new clustering of the RCM mechanism. We're not part of the discussion of this document, and I'm sure it has been thoroughly negotiated among the colleagues, but I'm surprised that the recommended option excludes governance issues. And the central thrust, in my view, of the Agenda 2063 is transformative leadership. And there is an assumption that that task is completed, that now we must focus on infrastructure and a lot of other very good things that are targeted in the document. So I'm just appealing, if possible, for colleagues to consider reinserting governance as an issue in the clusters, but particularly within the frame of transformative leadership, which is the message that is in the approach in the in Agenda 2060, instead of simple passive governance and governance institution. But I think Agenda 2063 puts a lot of emphasis on transformative, that we need leadership, but a particular kind of leadership to drive the Agenda 2063. That's my first observation. The second observation, it's more like a perspective to say that when we talk about Agenda 2063, we need to look at it in terms of, in the context of how Africa has dealt or approached Pan-African unity, because the end product of this exercise is Africa that is prosperous and united, a United States of Africa, which has been our historic mission. In the 1960s,
it was, we saw ourselves achieving this objective through intergovernmental cooperation. And from the 1970s into the 1990s, there was a shift towards regional integration. And so regional integration, but regional integration through stages. But now with Agenda 2063, it's regional integration through long-term planning. So with long-term planning, I'm raising this methodologically because once you measure regional integration through stages is not the same way that you measure regional integration through long-term planning, because long-term planning, which is in Agenda 2063, is based on drivers, and for each driver you identify goals, etc., etc., etc. I think for me it's a very important framing that I think we should not lose as we think about methodologies and so on. But I want to take this opportunity, Madam, in the 10 minutes you have given us, to say what are the lessons that we can draw from the APRM exercise over the last 13 years as we look at the instruments, the tools that we'll be utilizing to measure and follow up and monitor the implementation of SDGs/Agenda 2063 on the continent. The first thing we have learned with the APRM over the last 13 years is that you should avoid going for a tool or a methodology that is labor intensive. Because this methodology tends to be very difficult to execute and roll out on the continent. And particularly the issue of the questionnaires and the kind of tools you use that are over demanding, and we're trying at the moment to move away from a methodology that is very, very labor intensive and demanding on the member states. Because in the end, you have a situation where member states then participate in the process for compliance and as an end in itself, not for the intended objective of the exercise. And it becomes the first problem. The second thing is that we should also avoid a methodology that is very dense, especially with respect to the indicators. APRM, we've got quite a lot of indicators, and some of the member states, 13 years later, are still struggling with them. So I think that if we come with indicators, and I know there's a process underway, that we need to think carefully about those indicators and see about the applicability, usability, etc., etc., etc. But also bearing in mind that Africans are being over-evaluated and over-reviewed. There are other agencies, or even NGOs, that are also have their own indicators that are using on the continent and applying to our member state. Sometimes at country level, it's the same official who has to answer and deal with those indicators. It can be very confusing and very problematic. So we need to avoid a situation of creating indicator confusion and indicator fatigue on the continent. The third experience for us is that we think that as the tools that we have to use can learn from the APRM that they need to be peer-based and owned by countries, vis-a-vis based on a practice, or what you could not practice really, on some form of paternalism and messianism. To think that there are some actors who've got the solutions and they are bringing these solutions to member countries. But we find that when the process is peer-based and owned by countries, there is a much greater chance that there is the intended objectives could be realized. The fourth, of course, experience with which we want to share with you is that our processes are self-assessment based. So member states, so you don't have a soldier of assessors coming into a country. It begins with member states assessing themselves first. So they assess themselves, and when we deploy our own teams there, they are there to engage the self-assessment process and agree on the assessment outcome with the country concerned. So we find the self-assessment process very, very useful, as opposed to an assessment that is based on policing and some externally engineered exercise. The fifth one is that, and it's something that we have not done that we think that is very important we can share with you, is that the assessments or the reviews must be followed up. So you don't just get a report, like for example, let's say in the case of, if we agree with the outcome here is going to be member states reporting at the end of the year or at a particular time of the year. What happens with those reports? So what we are trying to implement now is that there must be a follow-up to the assessment outcomes. So the follow-up must not just be maybe, Your Excellency, thank you very much for reporting, etc., but must also entail the deployment of capacity building measures or support measures to the countries concerned. So it's one of the things that we are going to be trying to do now with our national implementation plans, which are the outcomes of the peer review exercise. So it's something that we think we can share with this, and perhaps colleagues could consider including in the assessment and follow-up measures that are under consideration. And then, of course, the sixth one is popular participation. And I've not heard us talking a lot about popular participation at country level, even continent-wide. I think we've been talking about a state-led exercise, which is quite good. But in the case of the APRM, they run concurrently. We have a state-led exercises, but with a very strong popular participation in the form of the involvement of the national governing councils that are comprised of non-state, multi-stakeholders at country level. So I think the popular component, popular to the assessments, to the implementation of the SDGs or Agenda 2063. In my view, I think it's something that you can take from and learn from the APRM, and we've got NGCs in quite a number of countries, and we've got an experience that we can bring to the table in this regard. And then Abdallah Hamdok spoke about the country-level implementation and follow-up mechanism. In our case, we have the focal points, we have the national secretariats, and we also have the national governing councils. But we have just realized, but the problem we encounter with these mechanisms is that they are located at different points within the state. In some countries, you find that they are in the foreign ministry, in other cases, in the Minister of Planning, in other cases, maybe they will be in the Minister of Regional Integration, and so. So we are trying to harmonize and try to synchronize and try to develop guidelines, and they may even be at different levels. For example, some focal points will be at ministerial level, some will be at senior officials level. So as we create in-country follow-up implementation mechanisms, it's very important that we standardize them, and it's important the level of authority we give to those follow-up entities at country level, because if it's just at the senior officials level, they may not have the political weight to be able to enforce and to do certain things within countries. So it's something that we have, we find value. And then the last point, Madam Chair, is that it's important that we, the synchronization or the integration in the of the national plans. I think it's a point that was raised even at the beginning of the session, that the success of this exercise is in the domestication. So the form of domestication is the integration of the follow-up or the measurement tools that we are going to be working on into the national development plans. But the point I wanted to make here is that this is not automatic and straightforward. We find that in the majority of APRM countries that have even gone through the reviews and did the national plan of action and so on, those national plan of actions are not integrated into the national development plans. So you find that they run parallel and they run concurrently. And this goes back to the question of where do you locate the national follow-up or reporting mechanism? So if you locate it in the Ministry of Planning, it's most likely to be aligned with the national development plans. But if you locate it in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it will just be a matter of compliance and reporting to the international body. So those are some of you could say, the 8 areas where we thought that we could throw into the discussion and say, as you go and try to think about how to harmonize and synchronize SDGs and Agenda 2063 and try to develop a common and a composite tool to measure and follow up the implementation, that we've got an APRM experience that we have been, we're familiar with over the last 13 years. And it has some lessons that we don't have to repeat, and which we think that if we take into account, we make sure that the work we're doing realizes its own intended objectives. And then the last point, of course, in conclusion, is just to appeal to the organizers to say that the recommended clusters, if they live out of the RCM mechanism, if they live out transformative leadership, I think that we'll be living out the subjective factor required and the political will we need to realize the objectives of the SDGs and the Agenda 2060. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Eddie Maloka, for sharing lessons learned from the APRM processes. And on this note, I'm going back to logistics. It's 11:42. I am in coffee is available and waiting. And in consultation with my colleagues here on the podium, I'm suggesting to break for coffee and 15 minutes for coffee, and come back for plenary discussions and Q&A. Yes, the session is adjourned.